Welcome to Navigating American Dictatorship. This is Dr. Louis Trams's Trump-era teachings, and I'm Michael Louis Trams, now talking about the cost of dictatorship.
You're not going to be a dictator, are you? I said, no, other than day one.
When I once ran an organic farming, gardening, and sustainable energy project in western Iowa, we ordered chickens. We wanted some layers, so Hampshire Reds and Barred Rocks and all the rest, lovely little chickens. And we ordered the broilers. Well, they all arrived in these little crates of the little chicks. We separated them, and the broilers that we would eat grew really quickly, and they were running around, and they were robust, and they were enthusiastic and ambitious. The layers were they seemed sickly, and it was slow. Their whole growth we thought something was wrong with them. And in the end, those that grew slowly and organically, if you will, turned out to be beautiful, productive creatures that we had for a long time. And the broilers, who at first were so promising, were so impressive, this new genetically altered generation, they all grew up to be monsters. They would fall over the feeders. They would lay the feeders sort of groaning and yet eating. They had so much breast meat they couldn't walk. They often died. We lost a lot of them. Heart failure, respiratory problems. The metaphor is really about how we humans design systems, how we govern ourselves. So democracy often seems sickly and messy and fragile and sometimes threatening, other times more promising. Dictatorship initially can seem sort of sexy. I mean, look, the Third Reich uniforms, ooh, baby. All those big Soviet parades with their big phallic weapons and all the... So dictatorship at first is, it wins people over, doesn't it? It's attractive, no more long public discussions about things. Just set it through, get it done. Look at China. We don't talk about the price the people have paid for the Great Leap Forward, but yeah, you get the idea. Well, speaking from experience, I've lived 30 years in Germany and traveled there a lot and had many sojourns there since 1980. So since 1980, I've been going to Germany. Now I'm a German citizen as well, as an American citizen. I vote in both countries. I'm entitled to do that. I have lived with the consequences among the wrecks of those who experienced dictatorship. When I first came in 1980, I was 17. Everyone over 30 that I encountered had been alive in the 1940s. Everyone over 30 that I encountered had been alive in Germany in the 40s. And some of them in the 30s and 20s and the teens. To this day, every German family has a story, almost always a sad story. Almost no Germans have happy stories from that period, hardly any. What happens with dictatorship is there's an intrinsic instability that's ultimately brought about. At first, with the police forces and the monitoring of the population and spy networks, the Gestapo, later on the East Germans had the Stasi, so things seem secure. Things seem predictable, safe even. The East Germans talk about how they grew up in the GDR, we'd say in English, in German the DDR, and it was a great childhood, no worries, you could walk home from school, no problems, great. They talk now about Afghanistan, article last week, that many Afghanis returning to visit who fled a couple of years ago and now are going back to visit relatives are so impressed with the safety. But all that safety comes at a cost. There's the short-term cost and the long-term cost. The Soviet regime always talked about 5-year plans. Their economic plans, and with that their social plans, because the two were not separable in the Soviet Union. The whole idea supposedly of having 5-year plans and this kind of communism was to change the society and to lift up everybody. Didn't quite work like that. But along in the 5-year plans, the Politburo really wasn't looking. And the transfer of power, it sort of coughed and sputtered. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev. Same in the East German regime. The Nazi regime had no long-term planning. By the way, I forgot to mention in the last episode that dictators have allies, they don't have real friends. Case in point would be Ernst Röhm. The open secret was he was a gay guy. He and Hitler were very close buddies for a long time. But during the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler was quite happy to expend Ernst Röhm in the purge of the SA. A fun historical fact, it was an American woman who saved Hitler's life at least once, plausibly, and perhaps twice as she claimed. Read our panels in our exhibit. Anyway, dictatorships don't have friends, really. They have allies. Allies shift, come and go. So you can be the Führer's friend today, and you could be dead tomorrow, whenever there's a need to purge the ranks. So everyone is kept nervous. There's no long-term plans for transfer of power. So when a great leader dies, there is this vacuum. Who's really being dressed in the side wings to take over when Putin dies, which hopefully will be sooner than later? Who will really take over Xi Jinping in China? Or this man in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who will take over that? So a dictatorship is bad for the culture, short-term and long-term. The culture changes. There's always this insecurity. People never quite know where they really stand with the regime. They really don't know about their fortunes in their career, whether they're teachers or police officers or anybody else. I feel they'll be in favor or out of favor. It's like the flavor of the month or the week. In almost all these cases, when a dictatorship slowly draws to an end or abruptly draws to an end, there is this violent transfer of power, either internally, a struggle to carry on, or externally, a war. As I said before, governments, especially dictatorial ones, they sort of need war as the project that keeps them going after their first initial euphoria fades. The only way to keep the whole show going is to have an external enemy or an internal one, but especially an external one, and have a war. So there's this vacuum of power. Then factions within the culture struggle once the great leader is dead or went running or in hiding or whatever. So dictatorship leads to instability because there's no organic structures. All the natural evolution over time, yes, this messy process of finding agreement and consensus, it crumbles and it's hard to revive it. And the longer that the dictatorship lasts, the harder it is to revive civil society. There are all these unintended consequences. No dictatorship ever started that really reached its stated initial goals. And all these side spin-off developments happened that no one foresaw. For example, you would never have had the East German communist regime without Hitler. There are two countries in the modern history of humanity that have been created from the Third Reich. One was East Germany, the spin-off of the Russian occupation of the former eastern regions of Nazi Germany, and Israel. Those are the two states created out of the mess of Nazism. Rightfully, those Jews that survived wanted to have a safe space. Public opinion, international maneuvering, Israel. No Hitler, no Honecker, no Hitler. So normally these people have these great schemes, 1,000-year Reich. The German people, das Volk, will rise and become superhumans because they were already genetically indicated for that title, right? The leaders really don't usually care about the people. Hitler kept talking all the time in the 30s and the 20s, but in the 30s when he came to power, about das Volk and the people and Germanness and German culture and German traditions and the German great future. But when push came to shove and this Red Army was advancing and we slowly from the West, they sacrificed a lot of German people, good Aryans, not the enemies of the regime, but their own people, sent to slaughter. When the Red Army crossed the Oder, the Nazi regime could have capitulated, didn't. To the end, these narcissistic Nazi leaders clung to their delusions under the streets of Berlin until the Russians appeared at the gate of the chancellery. So there might be euphoria now. All these voters who thought they're getting one package will get another. And this brings me to something that's very difficult. I cited earlier favorite history professors, teachers of mine who gave me great little, sound bites. One being history as a seamless garment. But another was a professor at Iowa State who himself had been in the military. He was actually in the ROTC at Iowa State and taught military history, among other things. He said that history is a great river. If you learn to navigate it, all rivers have certain elements alike, but it's never the same river twice. So Hitler, on the surface, has nothing in common with Stalin, who has nothing in common with Xi Jinping or Donald Trump. And yet these dynamics, these patterns that we set out to look for in the beginning, they're there. And what I can say is that super machines, these mega machines in nations, remember when I said that when we were still organized by tribes and then little warlords had kingdoms, fiefdoms that have evolved, in a tribe or a big family, it's relatively easier to leave, to say, I'm not going to do this, or even to resist, just disappear. But when you're part of a larger thing, a country, and especially a big country like Russia or America or Brazil or China or India, there's such momentum that gets going. It takes on its own thing. And Nazi Germany, you could argue Germany is one of the most important countries in Europe, certainly it's among the largest and largest economy today. So many Germans did not really approve of kicking the local Jews or invading Poland. And they were afraid they'd lost millions of their sons and husbands and lovers. And in First World War, a lot of Germans really weren't that eager to go into the second one. A lot of them later claimed, what could we do? Of course, by then, their opposition was too late. But for me, the most tragic thing is the things that the German people were brought to do in the name of dictatorship. As I've said before, Hitler never drove a single train to Auschwitz. He got others to do it. He didn't drop the canisters of gas into the showers. He got others to murder all those Jews and Sinti and Romi and gay people and all the rest. It's the thing that the people at the top make palatable. The lying, the name-calling, the threatening. That's the risk. That in a dictatorship, the common people lose their humanity because either they join happily and gleefully at the beginning, or they're forced into falling in line with these big projects, but then they commit grave, brutal acts of violence and crimes. And that not only wounds or kills those at the receiving end, but it kills inside the people doing these bad things. A metaphor, all these people that were rounded up in Nazi Germany and occupied Europe and sent off to the camps, or Ukrainian peasants fighting the German occupation, fill in the blank. A parable today, Donald Trump says he wants to round up 11 million people as of the first day in office, and he's appointed this guy who's all gung-ho and says, pack your bags because we're going to come for you, we're going to get you. Have you ever thought about this? Out of the 11 million people that the number's touted, will half go willingly to be deported on a bus or a plane or in vans? Will they go to the Mexican border? What if they're not Mexicans? What if they're from Venezuela or from China or from Nigeria? Where will they go? What are they going to do? In World War II, thousands, 140-some thousand Japanese Americans were put in camps in the deserts, people whose only crime was their ethnicity. And there were thousands of German Americans, best estimates maybe 15,000, camps in Texas. There were 60 camps and detention centers across the country. Google it, Camp Crystal City, Texas. There are films, U.S. government films from 45 or 44, bad color films, but they're color films at the Department of Justice, showing German children, women and men. Almost all the children have been born in the United States. They're almost all citizens. None of them had a charge or a lawyer. Many of the wives were American women or American German women. It was their husbands who had not yet had their naturalization papers signed and processed. So they were legal aliens. None of these people were illegally in the country, but they were put in camps. And they disappeared. Some of them till September 48. I know, I interviewed them. I used to speak with them in our Basim. There are tapes on the internet, interviews with Eb Foor, Art Jacobs. They're now all gone, unfortunately. So there are great injustices that happened during dictatorship. We kidnapped thousands of German and Japanese Latin Americans, over 2,400 Peruvian Japanese who had done nothing to us. We brought them to Texas. Why? Same reason why we kidnapped thousands of Germans from Panama, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru. Do the research. I've done it. These people were kidnapped and brought to Texas through New Orleans, and some sent to other camps, North Dakota, Stringtown, Oklahoma. Do the research. It's on our website as well. We used them as hostages to trade with Berlin and Tokyo for access-held Americans. This is human trafficking. All in the name of war and security, but these people were not a threat to us. Not the German Americans living in the country, but certainly not the German Latin Americans. So even earlier, Hoover and then Roosevelt were rounding up Hispanic Americans, even people whose ancestors came to what's now New Mexico in the 1600s, rounded them up. The numbers hard to document. Even USA Today once had a full-page story about this event in the 1930s. They're running up with Google it, the deportation of Hispanics, 1930s. Some of them had been generations in the United States, didn't even speak Spanish, and almost none of them had a place to go, yet they were rounded up all the way from the northern plains, Idaho, Montana, down through the Great Plains to New Mexico, California, Texas, and they were sent on buses and trains across the border. The young people couldn't speak with their grandparents or their non-immigrated aunts and uncles, and they had no land. A lot of them ended up in little shanty towns. It wasn't really legal. None of them had trials. Many of them had been purposely, probably hurriedly gathered in the night. They weren't allowed time to find their papers, so they had no proof that they were really American citizens. Anyway, those are just two great injustices that took place in a democracy, one during economic depression and one during war. Well, what's possible in America during a dictatorship? Back to 11 million people. So say half of them go willingly or voluntarily, they go peaceably. To where, to what? They're not all Mexicans, are they? But what about the other half that have an American wife or American children or a house or a job or a car? Would you be willing to give up your house and your family and your job and things you've built up? My people began coming in the 1630s to North America. The last ones came in 1888. None of them had papers. Donald Trump's mother came from a northwest Scottish island in 1930. She was 18 years old, married Trump. Did she have papers? I don't know. And two of his three wives had been immigrants. I suppose they had some visas. But to single out all these illegal immigrants, people who do the work that people like me don't want to do, mow the lawns, put the new roofs on after a hailstorm, nanny the children, clean our schools after our children go home. Half of them really want to stay. If they don't go, Donald Trump isn't going to wrestle the floor and put him in a bus. It's going to be you or your cousin or your nephew or your neighbor or someone from your church who on Sunday professes great Christian love and forgiveness, but during the week is going to the job and tracking down people who are in hiding and ripping them screaming from their children or their place of employment. Are we going to put these people, once we finally wrestle them from their grip on their loved ones and the lives they've built, are we going to put them in detention centers, behind bars? Are we going to beat them if they don't go willingly? Are we going to tase them? Are we going to gas them? Half of 11 million is 5.5 million people. The Nazis did in 6 million Jews. 5.5 is a good down payment on reaching that precedence. For me as historian, the greatest threat of having a dictatorship, unintended consequences, war, power vacuums, civil strife, the killing of civil culture, of bona fide religion or spirituality, and above all, the tragedies, hurting people, murdering people. If trans people insist on undergoing trans therapies, is the government going to send people to stop them? Are we going to tie their wrists to a stretcher and hold them down from undergoing therapies? Are we going to put them in institutions? Are we going to punish them? Are we going to put them in camps? If they're in camps, are we going to feed them well? Will they have visitors? Will they have a lawyer? In the 1930s, we rounded up. The historians generally agree a couple 100,000. Some estimates of the deported Hispanics goes to 300,000. I don't know. Some have said 500,000. I don't know. I wasn't there. My family was. They weren't paying attention. They never talked about it, even though Grandma and Grandpa Tramps had Hispanic friends. No one ever mentioned the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Hispanic Americans, either citizens or residents. 1941 onward, imprisoning hundreds of thousands of Japanese and German Americans. This was during war in a democracy. What are we willing to do when things get heated in a dictatorship? We've never had this experience. And I don't think it's advisable we have it now, but it's taking place, it's forming, it's taking root. And it's up to us to try to mitigate the worst consequences. And that will happen largely by thinking critically, and then acting. The time to do nothing has come. This is what I can do in my own little imperfect way with bad lighting and the computers on an ironing board. And it isn't the style anymore. It's not the packaging and it looks great and social media. It's about me and you having a conversation, not left, not right, always up front. Be direct, be heartfelt, make mistakes, but acknowledge the mistakes, but do something. Because you may not be interested in politics, but politics are interested in you. And don't think you're safe. You may be today, you may not be tomorrow. Are the ones you love? Are the ones working for you? Are the ones making your great American lifestyle possible? That's all going to come to a crashing end sooner than you think. You've been warned. Please do something.